I'm glad to be back. As I may have said last time, I can't imagine anything more fun than talking about plants and gardens. That's been true my whole life, pretty much as a 7 or 8 year old. So nerdy child growing up, as you can see. But I am a professor of landscape architecture at UGA, and tonight I want to talk a lot about how to relate, your home most likely, or it could be a different kind of building, to the landscape. And that's interesting that Mark started us off with some of those stats or statistics about millennials and other generations and how they see or perceive the landscape and its importance to the home. That's really encouraging that 75% of millennials think that. So it's time to invest in nurseries and garden centers, right? But I hope so, because we have a long ways to go. So sometimes I get to do this as the professor, right? I get to pick on bad, quote, bad landscapes. And I don't know, I just threw some images in here. These are just kind of typical houses probably that we could expect to see in neighborhoods around us. This one in particular, I think, is just, it's like every new house that's being built today in neighborhoods is some version of that, it seems like. We can let the architect talk about that later. But the landscape is what I'm going to focus on. And, this is kind of what we tend to do, right? This is like just the decoration, the shrubs around the base of the house, which is not very exciting. So much more can be done. So I want to talk about some basics of how to think about the design of a landscape and relate it to the house, and go beyond just kind of this parsley around the turkey. So I always like to give a plug for this book, Bringing Nature Home, if you're interested in more of the ecology of what's happening around you in the yard and how your garden can be part of the ecosystem in a deep and meaningful way. This is a great reader for that. It's very friendly and interesting, so I recommend it. Interesting article related to what we're talking about. It's kind of not a new article anymore. This is from the mid-90s, but Joan Nassauer is a professor of landscape architecture at Michigan. And she did a study, and I'm sorry, these are so small. I know you can't really see these. You'll just have to trust me. But she did this really interesting survey of Midwesterners where she asked them to just look at images, and this is all the same house in these images, but they had used Photoshop and some other software to manipulate the landscape. And so it goes from kind of like the images I just showed you a second ago, mostly lawn, not a whole lot happening with the planting, to kind of like increasing levels of planting that occupies the front yard. And as up to about like 75% of the lawn being removed, and prairie type, like Midwestern prairie landscape, taking up a big portion of the yard space. And in a couple of the iterations, there's a grove of trees as well. So she asked the survey participants, something like 1,500 participants in the survey, just what landscapes they preferred, which ones did they find the most beautiful, and there were some other questions in there as well. And so going from basically all lawn to 75% planted, and the middle ground was 50%. Guess which one folks preferred? But between the 50 and 75%, yeah, leaning that way, which I think is remarkable. Maybe kind of surprising even that many people did respond with that preference. That's really encouraging, I think, that, okay, people are interested in a little more than just the grass. But lots of folks haven't quite gotten there yet, and it does take some work and investment to get there. Just a few images of what I would call more naturalistic, landscapes. This happens to be my old front yard. So just, I guess it's like, proof that I practice what I preach, or at least I try to. We don't live here anymore, so somebody else does. But this was wrapping around the front corner. We lived on a corner, so the street corner here. And my girls are a lot bigger than this now. but just kind of showing you that's the front of the house over here. And that's a lot of plants, right? And okay, so probably two things just happened. Some of you are like, oh boy, I've got to go. And then other folks got more interested maybe. But, the wilder and more chaotic, the more I tend to love it. Or maybe a balance in there somewhere. But more diverse plantings, more intricate plantings, more numbers of species. I think that's what our gardens need to do. A reduction in lawn, but lawn does have a place. I would never want anyone to think I'm saying no more turf. It serves many great purposes in daily life: recreation, play for the kids, have a picnic. It's functional. We can't like weave our way through waist-high vegetation everywhere we go, obviously. And so some of these images I also show you to sort of prep the talk tonight for you to be prepared for this idea of framing spaces with plantings. That's the idea. You've probably heard before making rooms outside, right? Outdoor rooms. It's a great concept. It does work. So another great book you might want to pick up, Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner. A lot of techniques in here about how to create those thick, like matrix plantings that we were just looking at. So a good primer on that. I love his old blog where he makes fun of what he calls our addiction to mulch. We got to see as much mulch as possible. The mulch is beautiful. No, it's not. And so this is Thomas's front yard. He lives in Washington, D.C., and I think that is beautiful. And this is all this is fairly low. This is all stuff that's only about like under knee high, so very controlled, quite beautiful. A great book, and I have used a lot of graphics out of this book tonight, so I have to be careful to give lots of credit to Norman Booth and James Hiss, both landscape architects. This book is now in its 7th edition, and it looks like it's out of print at the moment. You have to buy the Kindle version, which is probably fine, but maybe they're doing a reprinting. But a very helpful sort of like first course in planting design. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of things. One of those is what I think probably a lot of us spend a lot of time doing, which is we think about, like, what does my house look like from the street? Like what do people see when they first drive up or drive by or arrive for a party or something? That's really important, first impression. And when you're thinking about your house that way, and you could think this way about any side of it, right? The back, the side view, any of those, you're thinking in elevation. In many ways, you're kind of thinking flat. Like, what does this look like? And these drawings, you can tell this is a three-dimensional place, but they also are kind of flat, right? You have to be careful with that because it can mess you up in planning. But what can be a lot of fun in an elevation view of your house is to think about planting design architecturally. Think about plants as their basic geometric forms. Is it a cone shape? Is it a round sphere, naturally? Is it a big, large oval? And really, at the same time, be careful about the scale and the size of it, right? And the fun thing about working this way, and you can do this easily, right? You can print out a photo of your house and just draw on top of it with a Sharpie. It's a lot of fun to do that. You mess up, doesn't matter, throw it away and do another one. Or if you've got a whiteboard and you can project the image on that, there's lots of ways to do this. But just think about it geometrically. And what's great about that is that if you're not a walking encyclopedia of plants, if you don't have 1,000 plants in your head that you can just use as a Rolodex, don't worry about it. Just think geometrically at first. Come up with a composition that's pleasing to the eye, and then begin to look for plants that fit that category. Like, okay, in this case, I need to find a large sort of rounded shrub or small tree. This could be either category, right? And look at the scale of the house here. This is not a measured drawing, or at least I don't have a scale here, but you can tell by like, a person's going to enter the door. So this is about 12 to 15 feet tall and wide. Okay, that's something you can latch onto, right? 12 to 15 feet tall and wide. This looks like it's probably deciduous the way it's drawn. Now you're like narrowing it down to a category that you could come here to Cofer's and you could say, Stuart, I need a 12 to 15 foot tall deciduous plant. What is it?
12 foot tall deciduous?
Hurry, hurry.
Tree. 12 foot tall, gonna be a tree.
Yeah. Japanese maple. Good choice. Good choice. Yeah. You didn't know this was gonna be like a live quiz, right? Okay, and this one, these look evergreen, don't they? Everybody loves a nice conical evergreen. It's just so like, oh, so pleasing to the eye. But that's so hard to choose one that actually does this long term, right? Yeah, how many of you have made that mistake? Does Nellie R. Stevens do this after 10 years? No. It's actually pretty difficult. Maybe a Chemiciperus. Anyway, I'm going to start going down the rabbit trail of plant names. But so work geometrically. Think about the composition, and I love the variety of kind of styles here. Notice we have kind of a simple, I don't know what we'd call that, a cottage here at the top. Simple lines, but notice how this sort of large shrub / small tree kind of acts as a balancing anchor over there to the left, right? In terms of massing and proportion of elements. And the kind of a similar concept here where we have an asymmetrical house. It's not like a federal style house with everything perfectly symmetrical. This is kind of asymmetrical, and there's great beauty in that. But these evergreens, this is ingenious, whoever drew this and placed these here, because they help to kind of balance the heavier visual massing of the house, which is to the left over here. So if you imagine, that all of this is on a balance, and there's a fulcrum underneath this. The fulcrum is, it's somewhere in here. And then the same down here at the bottom. Now, we don't see a lot of these modern or perhaps even prairie-style houses. There's a few around town here in Athens. But look at these really strong horizontal lines. Well, what are these verticals doing? Anybody describe that? Some height? I heard another answer.
Contrast.
Yes, they're exactly contrast. I love how these break it. They break that strong horizontal, and that creates a lot of visual drama here in this view. So if we really, again, break it down to basic geometry, we can study that lots of ways, where we just look at shapes and repeating them and creating patterns out of them. This is easily seen in, say, fences and walls, where you have columns and then panels, and this repeats. Well, you can apply the same concept to plants and really, create a very interesting visual with plants by just creating a pattern like that with a few species. This is a great way to approach, say, perhaps a visual barrier between you and a neighbor, or between you and a undesirable view. Maybe there's something you don't want to see. More iterations of the same thing here. And taller plants tend to kind of become the focal point just because they're a little bigger, especially if they are kind of columnar in habit. That's like a literal exclamation point in the landscape. Who here loves Italian cypresses? Yeah, I do. I'm totally in love with them, but you have to be really careful where you use them, because you want people to look somewhere, put an Italian cypress there, and eventually they get 50 feet tall. How many of you have driven up and down? I know you all have, right? Up and down Broad, And let's see, what is the church there? It's
Beach Haven Baptist.
Beach Haven. That line of Italian cypresses is gorgeous, isn't it?
We
But
sold them all those plants except for the first one.
I wondered why the first one was taller.
The first one was there. There used to be a Lincoln Mercury dealership right there.
Uh-huh.
They planted. That's the first one, probably in Georgia.
Oh, wow.
Probably planted back in the 70s. At that time, nobody knew they would live there.
How about that? Well, they're doing good. Doing well. Okay. So, the idea here is we want to connect things, right? We're creating a composition. We want it to all go together. And so some of the lower elements, the lower plants in the composition serve that function, whether that's a ground cover or maybe even, a perennial that only gets about 2 feet tall or so. But that becomes kind of like the glue to tie it all together if you have a lot of bigger things but a large planting. Instead of mulch. Doesn't have to be mulch. Now, my wife makes fun of me because of this concept, because she's like, oh, you've always got to have 3 of something, or 5 or 7 or 9. But there is a reason for that. Only in special occasions are we allowed to have 2 or a pair. And it's because, and you can test this yourself. You can walk around the next few days looking at things in pairs or 3s, and it's kind of a fun experiment. But you realize that when things are in pairs, your eye naturally wants to divide the 2. It wants to find center. And when you have an odd grouping, it's naturally the center element is kind of the anchoring focal point. So because of that, pairs of plants tend to make a wonderful statement, like on each side of a front door, because they flank, and they draw the eye back to that center. So that works with the front door because the front door is that third element. It's the thing to look at. Now, I did have a student once who used a pair of Italian cypresses, but on the other side of the composition was this big funky shrub that kind of balanced it, and it worked. I was impressed. Okay, so we've kind of talked about repetition. Repetition is important to create a sense of unity in the composition. Same concept as repeating a material on the facade or on the building, And notice I'm flipping here. I probably should have mentioned this before, but flipping between that elevation view and then the sort of sky view, right, the plan view. And that's where it's easy to get tripped up, because you can spend so much time putting together this perfect elevation, but if you're not translating that carefully into plan and how big things eventually will get, you can run into trouble. And so here we have, this could be somebody's backyard. That's kind of what it looks like to me. And notice that it's a great example of plantings that surround, in this case, one major space. And then there's this little kind of smaller nook over here that's a little more private. Maybe there's a place to sit over here and it's a little more quiet and hidden. So nice subdivision of spaces. We still have some axial symmetry here. So these are probably the rear doors off of, say, a living room. And we have a focal point here at the far end of the garden. So nicely done. Here's that idea I was talking about with, what we might think of as a typical balance beam here with symmetry. But here's the idea of asymmetrical balance. So things can be balanced even if they're not, perfectly symmetrical. Sometimes that's a weird concept to think about, but it's really exciting. So again, asymmetrical balance in plan view, where we still have a focal point. So if you're sitting on the couch in here in the living room, you can admire your plantings, or perhaps a statue or a fountain out here, or maybe just a bench. But once you come out and enter the garden, you're like, oh, hey, there's all these other spaces over here off to the side, and gets more interesting. There's maybe some mystery in the design. Mystery is a good thing. So a wonderful exercise also that you might do with your own home is to think about the floor plan or the blueprint of the house in plan view. So that set of drawings that they use during construction. But think about how you might draw that as an extension of the house into the landscape. So if you're thinking about an outdoor living room, well, I mean, draw it. Draw that space and that shape. Maybe first as if it's walls, and then begin to convert it to plants. Think about plants as walls. And now in section, so this is like a slice through, right? Think about smaller space. These are really tiny, aren't they? But there's a person here in the middle. I promise that's a person. And always think about, I think, especially in residential garden design, think about the scale of the space in relation to you as a person, or maybe a group of people. Is the space supposed to be able to accommodate 10 people for dinner? So you got to have a pretty big outdoor table, and then some space to walk around it, and then maybe the plantings that carve out that space. Or is it just somewhere you want to go read a book by yourself and not have anybody bother you? So that can be a much smaller sort of nook or pocket in the garden. All right, way too many slides, so a lot of these I won't spend much time on. This is like trying to cram a whole semester of planting design into one lecture. You guys are advanced. So a concept also that I love to see and talk about and talk about with my students at UGA because I feel like it's in some ways so rarely done, but it's so nice when it is done, is to bring the planting around to the street, connect the house with the street. If you live in a neighborhood where you're not a mile off the road, and you can decide how much you want the view of the house to remain intact. Do you want a big open view of the house, or do you want to kind of like filter it a little bit, right? And use plants as your filter. And that's one of the wonderful things about plants. We all have, well, you may have blinds in your house, or shades or something, but some way of controlling the amount of light, controlling the view in and out. Plants do the same thing, except they're way more complex than blinds or curtains. By choosing different plant material, you can have an extremely, a blocked view or many different gradations of permeability, in that view to the house. And that can make it really interesting. I love to take my students into the surrounding neighborhoods close to campus. This is in Plant ID when I teach that class. And when we walk down some of the streets like University Avenue, that one's close enough for us to get to. There's some great examples of front yards that have done this on that street, where the planting comes around and there's kind of like a panel of lawn in the middle, but it's not necessarily just all wide open to the street. And a fun discovery too in walking around those neighborhoods. Sometimes, people wonder like, why is there a mob of 25 people out there? And we do sometimes get invited though when they discover we're students. Students are like, everybody loves students. So we get invited into backyards sometimes, and we get to see some cool places. And but more than once, guess who? Once we visit, we find out who designed it. Ron Deal. Yeah, and there are some wonderful designs in that neighborhood that Ron Deal did. So yeah, I love it. And this is the first time we've ever met. We've talked on the phone, but okay. So some other examples of that, just not being afraid to carve up the front yard, make it more interesting. Thinking about enclosure, plants as walls, plants as ceiling, pergolas as ceiling. Um, and thinking about balance, using plants as masses is usually a good technique. Um, Thinking about somewhat of a balance between deciduous and evergreen plant material. I think this is somewhat a matter of personal taste and preference, but a lot of designers hover around the, say, 40 to 60% evergreen. So depending on how much you like evergreens, you may weigh heavier on that. In the past, I think it was higher. I think like 50s, 60s, 70s landscape design, it was all about evergreens. Evergreens everywhere. But I think slowly over time, I don't know if Stuart can confirm. I don't know. Are deciduous plants gaining popularity?
They are. 20 years ago, that was a hard sell.
Uh huh.
I mean, like native azaleas, you couldn't give a native azalea away 20 years ago, and everybody wants it.
Crazy. Yeah. Now they're like, $50 for a tiny little, right?
39.
39. Sold.
Cheaper than
Okay, and then if you were in my planting design class, we would take some time to talk about bed lines. Bed lines, they are so important. What is the shape, the bed, the planting bed and lawn, where those meet, or driveway, whatever it is? That line is very visually important in the design. And so it takes some time to get that right, together with the size of the plants you're planting, and get all that working together. But I like to kind of redline the drawings of students who they have sort of what I call a wandering bed line. It's like they haven't really decided yet, they haven't committed. Like, what is this supposed to do? You can tell. But something a little more purposeful would be something like this one, I think, where the curves are a bit simpler. They're a little cleaned up, and they just look really intentional, And actually, if we think back to geometry, comparing these two, we could break this into, only say 7 or 8 arcs, whereas this is really complex because it's so wiggly. And boy, you bring this drawing out and have the landscape contractor lay this out in the field. They're going to be mad at whoever drew this because it's difficult to do. And it's going to end up not reading as well when it's built, too. It's going to look like something's off here. I want to get to the end here because I know that even after you've gotten the design you love and you're ready to get going, it seems like the question is always, what plant? What should I plant? What works? And, I don't know if this will be up later on the website.
Yes, it will.
Or you can take a photo of this if you want. But these are just some suggestions that I wanted to give. And in particular, notice my first category here is plants under 12 inches tall. That might seem ridiculous. Like, who's ever going to even see that? But it's so important. You probably experienced this in your own garden and landscape where everything gets too big, right? Isn't that always the problem? It's like you're well-intentioned, you plant something, it looks so cute in that 3-gallon pot. 5 years later, it's like taking over the whole place. This is a lesson I've had to learn over and over again, even though I know better. I just get too excited when I'm at Cofer's and I'm like, just, give me all the plants. And I forget everything I know about, planning ahead. But this is all, stuff that stays small. And it's if you can control yourself and let it look a little sparse at first, when it's first installed, you're going to be happier later because things fill in and your maintenance is going to be lower from year to year because everything is just kind of staying where it's supposed to. And I love to, like if Durr was here or Armitage or something, I love to rib them, and that can be a lot of fun. But, some of these plants that we bring in from other places and we don't always know exactly what they're going to do. Maybe they haven't been field tested here in the U.S. long enough. But the latest one I would say are the distiliums. Have you seen the distiliums? Now they've been around a while now, maybe a decade, something like that. So there's a bunch of cultivars of distilium on the market. A bunch of them get really big eventually. Now I put in here maybe Cinnamon Girl is one that actually stays low, unless somebody tells me differently. And there's a couple of other small cultivars out there now too. But things like, you know, you're probably like, juniper, that's what I spent a lot of my life hating junipers. But I've come back around. I've realized there's a few that really are nice plants. They stay green and they stay low, and you know they have a place. Whoops. Okay, so this is going to make lots of people mad probably, but things that get too big, and what I meant to say here is 12 to 30 inches tall is this category. There's something magic about 30 inches or so. Once things get over that height, it starts to get uncomfortable. It starts to feel like things are getting out of hand. It's in that 30 inches to about head height zone where you just feel like the plants are taking over. Unless it's a tree and you know their trunks you can kind of see through. I mean, there are exceptions to that. But okay, plants that we all plant all the time that get bigger than this. Dwarf Yaupon. Dwarf Yaupon eventually gets like 4 to 5 feet tall. Now, if you want to shear it every year, you can keep it lower than that. But who likes to go out and shear plants all the time? Unless you're a topiary artist. Probably not. Ron does. There's a certain zen to it, I'm sure. You know. But, and this is another thing I tell my students all the time. Dwarf is a highly relative term, especially when used on a plant tag. That it may mean that that selection of that plant only gets 15 feet tall instead of 35 feet tall. Well, that's significant, but that doesn't mean it's something like this. So other things, I think the worst offender the last 20 years, loropetalum. Oh my gosh. I mean, people plant those like their life depends on it. And my 83-year-old mom has a new-ish house, you know, where it's loropetalum, you know, put across the front. So we have to deal with that. So, and people often don't believe me. They're like, it doesn't get that big. I'll say, you know, it gets 30 feet tall. So I'm going to prove it. My images are out of order here. Here it is. This is down in Savannah. Look at the size of the benches here. So here in Savannah, in one of the park squares down there, they've limbed it up like a dogwood tree, which is a great use of it. It's stunning. It's beautiful. But that's how big loropetalum wants to be, the species at least. This is right next to campus. You know, these are easily 25 feet tall. So now, you know, the same with loropetalum. Some of the newer cultivars, like what's the little one selling now? Pixie.
Peaches are real low, and Crimson Fire.
Crimson Fire. Okay, so in 10 years, if it's still under 3 feet tall, I might use it. So some other suggestions here. Switch to deciduous material here. You know, other common offenders. I hated to put this on here because you all hate me now, right? Most hydrangeas. I love hydrangeas. I can't get enough. But so many of them want to get 4 or 5 feet tall. So you just got to be careful where you put them. Okay.
All right.
Well,
Let's give a round of applause.
thank you. Oh, and shameless plug, like a salesman. It's terrible. If you want to buy my book, go to the UGA Press website.